The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 2 today. It doesn't seem too long ago that I was with you. It was 2 weeks ago, but it seems like yesterday. Look, I hope you had a chance to complete the conflict profile that is in the learning platform, because we spent a fair bit of time talking about that last time, and I think it gives you a sense of where you are and where you need to be. And I'm sure some of you did get a chance to complete that. And of course, the whole objective of last time we met was really to try and be as flexible as you can when you're dealing with conflict, and not just to box yourself into your preferred style, which is ultimately what that's about. Normal process today is, if you've got questions or comments, you'll notice there's a little question box over on the right-hand side. You just open that up and type in your question. I'll get to see it immediately. In fact, I'm the only one that gets to see it. And the moment I see it, of course, I'll respond to it. So that way we don't leave the sort of 10 minutes at the end while people are working out what question they want to ask. So please feel free to do that. So let's start. Let's look at the program and where we've come from, where we're going. As I mentioned to you, we talked about the 5 approaches to dealing with conflict last time. And I guess the point about all of that was that there is no one perfect way of dealing with conflict. Today, of course, we're going to look at people and their personalities, which is always a fun topic to look at. And I won't go through the rest of the program at this stage, but you can see it in front of you there. So let's have a look at last time we met. Now, last time we met, I exposed you to this model, which is Thomas Kilmann's conflict resolution model, which has been around for quite a period of time. And you can see that there are 5 different ways of dealing with conflict, and basically depending on 3 variables, really. That's your preference, which you will know if you've completed the profile, but even if you haven't, you've probably got a fair idea which of those 5 you probably gravitate the most to. The other variable, of course, is the situation that you're in, and the situation you're in can dictate how you might react to that. And of course, the third variable is the other person or their own profile. They may not have completed the profile as you have, but certainly they've got a certain way of dealing with conflict. Now, it's very difficult, of course, to be in the heat of the battle and be able to sort of put all those 3 things together and work out in some sort of a rational way which way to go. So the rule of thumb really is, if plan A isn't working, I need to try a plan B or a C or even a D or an E. So the whole idea is to be flexible enough to deal with the conflict that's in front of you at the time. So what we want to do now is, I'll just move to the next slide. And what I'd like you to do is, you might recall that last time we met, I asked you to vote. And I'm going to do that again now. So if you've got your mobile phone handy, I'm sure you have, if you could just pick it up as if you're going to send a text message. Now, if you were involved in this these surveys the last time we met, then of course you just have to find the thread, and you won't have to go in and get yourself registered again. But for those of you that haven't, there's the telephone number, 61 427 543 541 357. So if you just type that in, that's where you'll be sending the message to. So if you imagine you're sending a text message, that's what you type in, and then when the box opens up, the message that you're going to send, without any spaces at all, is Tim Baker. Now, it doesn't have to be uppercase. Tim Baker 849, no space between the R and the 8. So Tim Baker 849. Now, once you do that, you'll be given an opportunity to vote. And then what you can do is, I can see, thanks Nick. Nick's just pointed out there's a typo there on competing. Sorry. Yeah, I can see that, Nick. Sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. A bit hard to change it now, but I appreciate you letting me know. Now, all I want you to do is, I want you to type in from the survey, that is what you've done in terms of the profile. I want you to type in which is your preferred style. Now, no one will know. It's just a case of us doing a little survey with the group we've got in front of us. Do you favour competing? Do you favour accommodating? Do you favour compromising? Do you favour collaborating? Or do you favour avoiding when you're working with other people? So could I just get you to indicate on the survey where you sit, because this gives us a very interesting perspective. We've got a lot of people that are registered for this webinar, so it should give us an interesting perspective, and you can sort of see where your results compare to other people as such. All right, so those numbers will be moving around quite a bit over the next 60 seconds or so. So we'll just get everyone. And look, if you're wondering whether your vote's registered, by the time you click A, B, C, D, E, and if you look on your screen, you'll see the screen change, and that's probably an indication that you've voted, particularly if the bar that you voted on gets longer. All right, so those numbers are moving around quite significantly at the moment, so we'll just want to give everyone a chance to vote, because if we were sitting in a room, for example, under normal conditions, I would be asking you to indicate this anyway. We may not be doing it this way, but we'd be doing it a certain way. And so what it does is gives us a little bit of a profile of the group we're dealing with. All right, now, if you can see on your screen there, then obviously collaborating is the key. Well, it's come back a bit now, but you can see 40% of people at this stage at least think that collaborating is their number one preference. Now, as we said last time, of course, collaboration is something that you really require time, don't you? I mean, you have to actually sit down with someone and go through it with them. So sometimes we don't always have the time to do that, but certainly that in terms of the group is the favoured response. And then we've got a fairly close score between compromising and avoiding. So those of you who perhaps have, okay, so compromising surged ahead a little bit there. Those of you who perhaps your higher score was avoiding, just remember that there is a time and a place to avoid. So I'm not suggesting for a minute you shouldn't avoid. There are certain cases, and I explained that, but if it is your higher score, then it probably suggests that at times you probably should be involved, but you've sort of maybe convinced yourself that you shouldn't, and that in itself is not necessarily a good way to go. Those numbers are bouncing around, aren't they? So compromising, of course, is where you will make a concession and the other person will make a concession and you'll somehow meet in the middle. And accommodating is where you let them win the battle so you can win the war. And competing, of course, is a win-lose where you're trying to win at the expense of the other person. So that profile is very interesting now. We've got 30, 30, 30, which is really interesting around those last three. Anyway, so that's an interesting, and of course the minority are in competing and collaborating. So as I said, there's no one right way of doing anything. And the whole purpose of that was, one, to give you a sense of self-awareness, but secondly, to suggest to you that there is more than one way of dealing with a conflict situation. And what I want you to be trying to do is to experiment with this in this lunch and learn, in between the sessions, that is, and trying to use other approaches. So if you've got any questions or any comments or any observations, let me know. Nick's let me know. I've got a typo there and I appreciate that. But if anyone's got any comment or question they'd like to make, then go for your life. All right, let's move on. I wanted to move on to the next slide, if I may. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about, we've all heard about personality type, and, that comes from Carl Jung's work, which Carl Jung was the first psychologist that came up with the notion that people often can be typecast in terms of their personality type. And as you can imagine, it was highly controversial at the time. It still is. A lot of people say, well, how can you sort of categorize me and what have you? But it's a convenient tool for us to kind of understand how people might approach conflict from a personality perspective. And I'm going to do that today. And we're going to look at an overview of these four personality types. And then most importantly, I want to talk about some tips that might help you when you're dealing with that personality type, what you need to be mindful of and what their concerns might be, so that, you know, it's another layer of understanding for you in terms of dealing with conflict. All right, so that's what we're doing now. I think for some of you who have done my Lunch and Learn series, the management one, you know, some of this is very similar to what I did before, but the big difference here is that I'm going to talk about it from a conflict perspective rather than just a personality type. So let's talk about this a little further. Now, so what I'm really trying to do in our short session today is to provide you with a fun and a practical tool for understanding yourself and others and how they actually deal with conflict, or what they think in relation to conflict. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do. Conflict comes from the Greek word persona, meaning mask, and ultimately what it means is that all of us wear this mask. Now, the question that's often asked is, where does this mask come from? Is it something that I've learnt, or is it something that I'm born with? Where does this kind of personality persona come from? And of course, psychologists are not united on that. There's been a pendulum swing in many ways. Many years ago, it was considered that you're a product of your environment, so that your personality was pretty much shaped by the things that happened to you in the world. And then after a while, people started, say 30, 40 years ago, people started to think, well, hang on, I think personality is a innate predisposition. So that, in other words, you're born with a personality, not necessarily that it's hereditary, but that it's part of your DNA. And of course, many of us who have children would have noticed at the very early age, these sort of traits seem to be formed very early. So there seems to be some validity, at least, to that. The latest research on neuroplasticity would suggest that personality or your brain actually changes shape as you exercise it, and so what it suggests is that it's debunked many of these myths about we're too old to learn. Your personality is forming all the time. So there's a lot of perspectives on it. The main thing, of course, is to understand people and how they perhaps process conflict is essentially what you should do. So what I've got for you is another profile in the learning platform that I'd like you to complete, which is on personality type. So I want you to complete that so that you can get a sense of who you are. And by all means, share the model with your team. I mean, by all means, print it out and get your team to complete it. It's always a bit of fun to do that and have a conversation about those things. All right. So let's look at the model that I've used. I've adapted this model from a number of different models that are out there. We all know that there's an MBTI and there's a DISC profile and there's, it goes on and on and on. There are plenty of different instruments out there. But one of the problems with a lot of those instruments is that it's almost as if you need a degree to work out what they mean. And so what I've done is I've simplified it to 4 animals: an owl, a lamb, a bull, and a peacock. And of course, when we think about an owl, a lamb, and a bull, and a peacock, we get a pretty quick picture of that type of personality. So I've just kind of made it easier for people to, draw the distinction between animals and personalities. So that's what I've been doing. And when you complete the survey, you'll have 4 scores. And, you'll have a score for owl, you'll have a score for lamb, you'll have a score for bull, and you'll have a score for peacock. But of course, what you're looking at is the score that's the highest. And in that sense, that tells you something about the way you like to operate in a conflict environment. All right, so the model works like this. And you'll notice that I've put it's a typical 2x2 matrix. And you'll notice that I've obviously put the 4 animals into the matrix. There are 2 variables. Let's have a look at those variables. There is the concept of introversion and there's the concept of extroversion. Now, I'm sure you've heard those terms many times before. Unfortunately, there's a lot of myths and untruths that are about these two words, and I just want to demystify that today. All introvert and extrovert actually means is how somebody likes to recharge their batteries. So, for example, somebody who's truly an introvert will tend to recharge their batteries by being on their own or doing something in a solitary arrangement. Whereas an extrovert will often want to talk out, or they become energized by being involved with other people. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute, sometimes I like being on my own, sometimes I like being with people, and that's quite normal. And it's possible that you're a combination of both of those. I would suspect that when you've done the survey, and if we chart this next time, which we will, you'll probably find that there's a lot of people who are sort of in the middle between introversion and extroversion. So it very much depends on who you're with, how you're feeling, or dare I say, how much you've had to drink. So the other perspective is over on the right-hand side, where you've got task and people. So obviously in the workplace, there's a whole bunch of tasks to do. Of course, that's why we're employed. But of course, we don't do those in isolation, or most of the time at least. We work with and through other people to get the tasks done. But people will often have a bias towards a task or people. Now, one is not necessarily superior to the other. And as you can see there, the owl and the bull are very much more focused on task than people. Doesn't mean they don't like people. It just simply means that to them, getting the task done is the number one important thing to do. Whereas the lamb and the peacock, in many respects, I need to feel comfortable with the people I'm working with before I launch in and complete the tasks that I need to complete. So you've got those two variables as well. And then in the middle, of course, you've got the owl, you've got the bull, you've got the peacock, and of course, you've got the lamb. So that's a very simple explanation of the model. And so what I intend to do now is just go through and talk about each of those using some famous people to draw attention to those things. Then I want to finish up the program by talking about how these personalities might actually process conflict, and of course they're generalizations, and we have to be aware that people can be different around those things. But I think it might help you in your journey to be able to deal with conflict more effectively in the workplace by having this information. So what I'd like to do now is, what happened there? Oh, screen went blank. Okay, let's try something. Okay, let's try something. I don't know why. There we go. Ooh. I've got some funny things happening here. Let me see. Let me try something. Okay. Let me. Ooh. Okay, my slides don't work. Oh, here we go. There we go. It's on your screen. So I don't know what happened there. It must have clicked the wrong button, but never mind. So let's talk about the peacock. Now, I'm going to talk about these in order where they come up in the survey. So it's not because, I think the peacock's better than the owl or whatever it might be. These are just give you some sense of the four personality types. As I said, this work's based very much on MBTI and the original work that Carl Jung put together. So the primary motivation for the peacock is being popular. Now, these motivations are ideals. No one ever actually achieves that at all times. So the peacock, for example, will never be 100% popular. I mean, it's impossible because, there's always somebody out there that won't like somebody, but ultimately that's very important to them. And if you looked at their primary characteristics, and of course I'm talking about the exaggerated versions here, because you might have a part of this, but none of you who are doing this will actually have scores in one column and not the others. It's likely that they will be spread across the four. But if you get a score of 20 in a column, that's 50% of your personality is in that area, and that would suggest that a lot of this will ring true for you. But ultimately, the characteristics of the peacock is they tend to be extrovert. They tend to be talkers. In fact, they enjoy talking, and sometimes they might be accused of sometimes talking too much. And they're also an optimist. In other words, the glass is half full, not half empty in their mind. So that would generally sort of describe the peacock as such. So the basic strengths of a peacock is that they generally have an engaging personality. I'm sure you're already thinking about people in your team who may have these characteristics, but they've got an excuse me, they have an engaging personality. They are creative and colourful, and often, you'll know they're in the room, basically. They've usually got a high energy level, and they can be quite inspiring. So they'll always have a story or a joke or something that they want to sort of entertain the group with. And I'm sure if you've got peacocks that you work with, if you're not one yourself, you'd be very, very aware of that. Now, there are a couple of famous people I'll point out is, Paris Hilton, who probably doesn't show up so much these days, but certainly there was a story that many years ago she was sent to prison for, I think it was tax evasion. And I mean, I don't think she was in there for a long period of time, but she certainly went to prison, and she made this a publicity stunt and told the whole world about that. I don't know about you, but I would just quietly do my time and come out. And the great Scottish comedian who's going through some tough times at the moment, Billy Connolly, I'm sure many of you would recognise Billy Connolly as an extrovert. I mean, ultimately, he goes on the stage and goes off on any tangent, and it could go anywhere or anyhow, and it does. And that's how he likes to perform, and he's hilarious, and I'm sure many of you would know exactly what I'm talking about there. So ultimately, the peacock, their modus operandi when it comes to conflict is this: I like to be liked, and therefore I avoid conflict wherever possible. So the peacock is not somebody who would be necessarily very confronting, or certainly not intentionally anyway. They like to be liked, and because they like to be liked, they will probably try and avoid conflict wherever possible. And so that doesn't mean they don't get into conflict. It just simply means that when conflict does arise, it's often because they think before they speak. They might say something that they hadn't thought through carefully, and of course that could create a problem and so forth. But they like to be liked ultimately. So if you like to be liked, being in conflict is probably not an ideal scenario to be in. So let's look at the bull. The bull, their primary motivation, and again, it's an ideal, is being powerful. Now, it's impossible to be powerful all the time because it just is, just like you can't be popular all the time. But ultimately, the interesting thing about the bull is that their major insecurity is being taken advantage of. And so the argument there is that if I'm in control, then there's less likelihood that I will be taken advantage of. So they will tend to gravitate to leadership positions and so forth. Their major characteristics are, just like the peacock, are extrovert. They are doers, and in the sense that often a bull will have 5 or 6 things on the go at once, juggling all these things at once and trying to keep all these plates in the air. Often will bite off more than they can chew, would be another way of putting it. They're also, like the peacock, an optimist. So to them, the glass is half full. And their major characteristics are born leaders. Now, if you're a bull, don't get too excited at this stage, because what I mean by that is, of the 4 personalities, the bulls feel the most comfortable dealing with a leadership role, the responsibilities of leadership, and they're quite comfortable taking that on. They're very goal focused. They like to know what the end result looks like. They're not much into detail. They're not, in fact, details don't interest them too much. They're more interested in where we're going and what the end result is. And they often move quickly into action. like everyone, they may be prone to procrastination at different times, but I think of the four personalities that are least likely to procrastinate. Two famous people that might come to mind are Hillary Clinton and Madonna, and both of those people are very self-opinionated. They've got very strong views about their what they think is right and wrong, and they're not shy about expressing those views. Madonna, pretty much managed her career from the word go, and didn't put all of her, her aspirations into the hands of one or two people. She pretty much ran the show herself. And of course, Hillary Clinton was former Secretary of State and former presidential candidate and senator for New York. So, how does this personality deal with conflict? So here is probably an insight into their thinking. So what the bull will often think is that conflict can be a means to an end. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the bull actually enjoys conflict, but they might see it as a means to an end. So in other words, if I don't stand up to this person, or if I don't assert my needs, I may not get what I want. So that's how they look at these things. They don't like backing down because it's a sign of weakness, and of course, if they put themselves in a vulnerable position, people may take advantage of them. So they will often contest differences of viewpoint, and as a personality, they can be, sadly misunderstood because they're not necessarily difficult people. They just don't want to be taken advantage of, and they'll jump into the fray because they see it as essential to preserve their own dignity. So it's very much, that's the way they look at conflict. Now, let's move to more of the introvert now, and we'll talk about the owl to start with. So the owl's primary motivation is being perfect. Once again, none of us can be perfect. It's impossible, just like it is to be popular or to be powerful. But ultimately, what the owl tries to do is to get it right. So their modus operandi is to do an incredibly detailed job. And sometimes what will happen is that they'll take too long getting things done because of this notion of perfection. So if you look at their characteristics, they're introverts, so it's more likely that they'll be private in their own right. They're thinkers, and sometimes very deep thinkers, and they'll think long and hard about that. I remember distinctly somebody saying to me a couple of years ago, and I was coaching them, who happened to be an owl, and I said, how's your day been? They said, oh, something very strange happened this morning. I said, what? They said, so-and-so said hello to me. I said, oh, okay, that's nice. And they said, no, it's not. And I said, why isn't it nice? And they said, oh, something's very strange going on there. They've never done that before. In other words, they're thinking too deeply about it. And I said, well, maybe they were just happy to see you. And so that became very real. So in their mind at least. And so they're pessimists. They will tend to see the glass is half empty, not half full as such. So if you think about their strengths, they're often very schedule oriented. So they have a lot of structure in their life. They're very much list makers. They have very high standards. And interesting enough, it's not just high standards of you and me, it's high standards of themselves. And in fact, they can be their toughest enemy. Very tough standards on themselves. And they can be, of course, very orderly and organised. And they expect everybody else to be as well. And it annoys them no end if they're not. So two famous people that I could pick there would be Roger Federer, the great tennis player, who's still, I think he's injured at the moment, but he's still playing at the top of his game at, 38 or something, which is just phenomenal. But one of the reasons he's at the top of his game is that he practices. He's completely and utterly dedicated to practice. No one works harder than Roger Federer off the court. And the other one I picked, of course, is not around anymore, is Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist from the Enlightenment, and those. And of course, you can see the sketches of the human body down here. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, wanted to depict the muscular system of the human body perfectly. And I'm sure at school you can remember these sketches. But he actually read a story. He actually went into a graveyard and dug up a body, would you believe, and cut it up to try and understand how the muscular system works. So this personality can be quite obsessive. They want to get it right. So how do they deal with conflict? Well, they hate personal criticism. And one of the reasons for that is that they're always giving off their best. And so they don't enjoy that. And they can be very critical of themselves as well. So you've got to be very careful there in that one. Okay, so sorry, that should be, I come back here. That should be sulk, not suck, sorry. Another typo. So they can sulk, and they do sulk as such. All right, so the fourth personality type now, here we go. We've just got a question here. Okay. Hi, Sam. Yeah, you're laughing out aloud. Yeah, I don't blame you. I saw that. I thought that was interesting too when I read it. I should have checked my slides beforehand. But anyway, I'm glad you're entertained, but it certainly didn't mean that. All right, let's keep going. Now, let's talk about the lamb. The lamb, primary motivation is being peaceful. Now, again, it's impossible to be peaceful all the time. Two people on a desert island, there's going to be some conflict at some point. True? So it's impossible to be peaceful all the time, but ultimately that's what the lamb is trying to do. So you're probably getting a clear picture about how they might deal with conflict. Their characteristics are that they're introvert, just like the owl. They tend to be watchers, so they'll, in a meeting, for example, they'll wait for everyone else around the table or in the Zoom conference or whatever it is you're doing to have their say. And then once everyone else has had their say, they'll jump in and have their say as well. So they'll wait and watch, and often, like the owl, they're pessimists. The glass is half full, not half empty. And their strengths are that they're competent and steady. So you give a lamb a job to do, and they're very competent and steady, and they'll get the job done pretty well. And they're very agreeable and peaceful as well. They're non-threatening and they're easy to deal with, and they will mediate problems. And usually they're very good at that. So what happens if there's two sort of people having a conflict at work? The lamb will be able to see both sides, and if they're put in the position where they have to mediate that, they'll often be very, very good at that. So two personalities that come to mind are two actors, Keanu Reeves, one of my favourite actors, and Kirsten Stewart. They're both very quiet. They don't seek out publicity, you might note. In fact, the only time you'll see them interviewed is usually when it's in their contract to promote a movie or whatever, but ultimately they're quite happy to be on their own and do their own thing. So there's two people who come to mind pretty readily. And so when it comes to conflict, peace is important to them, and they don't want to rock the boat. So they don't necessarily will jump in and say something, and often they can be criticised for that later because people say, well, if you didn't agree with it, why didn't you say something? So they can be a bit like that. I'd rather say nothing than deal with the conflict is kind of how they think. So their idea is that, things like avoiding and accommodating would not be uncommon for them to do that. So that becomes... their modus operandi. So sometimes if they think if I say something it'll cause an argument, they will probably not say something as a result of that. So let's now start to look at where the rubber meets the road, and let's talk about each of the personalities and how you might deal with them. But I'll just take some questions first of all before we jump in to these. So Janine says, I can see I'm a combination of a couple of those. Yeah, look, you have to do the profile. Do the profile, Janine, and then obviously that'll confirm for you. I'm sure you are. It's look, none of you, when you do the profile, none of you, as I said before, you'll have 40 points in one column and 0, 0, 0 in the other 3. We're all a combination, and that's where the big criticism of personality comes in, because people say, oh, you can't sort of generalize about people. That's true, you can't, because the fact is our personality is a combination of all things. However, we will have a predisposition, most likely, towards one of these 4. And because we've got a predisposition to one of those 4, we'll probably feel most comfortable exhibiting that most of the time. So if you look at people under pressure, for example, it's likely that when you're under pressure, what happens is you will revert to type, as they say. In other words, your dominant personality trait will come out in that moment because you're under pressure. So look, it doesn't surprise me that you might think you're a combination of both, but do the profile, and then next fortnight, when we get back together, I'll get you to chart that, on the voting, and just see who we've got in the group and where people fit. Thank you. Anyone else got any questions or comments or observations at this point? All good? Okay, so let's have a look at how you deal with the peacock. Let's look at a couple of different traits about the peacock. Now, remember, the peacocks are extrovert, and what that means is that often they'll speak their mind. So what will happen is that they don't have a filter there often where they think before they speak. They just blurt it out. And obviously, sometimes when they blurt out the first thing that comes to their mind, it can be the wrong thing to say. And of course, the person on the receiving end can get enormously upset by that. But the peacock isn't filtering it. They're just saying it. They're just getting things off. It's just coming out. So the peacock doesn't think much before they speak. In fact, you could actually argue that the peacock actually thinks by speaking. All right. So those of you who might be peacocks can confirm that for me. But they will blurt it out. And so it's important insight, because if you're on the receiving end of one of these blurting out comments, whilst it might be hurtful and it might be wrong, all that sort of thing, don't overanalyze it too much, because it's perhaps true that they haven't really thought much about it. And funny thing is, if you walk up to them a week or 2 later and you said, the other day when you said such and such, don't be surprised they say, I can't remember, because they don't ponder those things too much. Another concept about the peacock that's important is that realize there's sometimes talk without thinking. I guess I've sort of mentioned that as well. So just be aware that there isn't the filter there often with the things that people say, and recognize their good efforts. It is important to do that. I think if you want to get the best from the peacock, if you're in that leadership role, recognize their good efforts, because recognition is something that the peacocks do seek, because they want to be popular, they want to be loved, and recognition. I mean, I'm not just saying, recognize them just for the sake of it. I mean, they've got to earn it, of course. But if they do, it's important to acknowledge that. Just remember this, that sometimes they'll want to please than confront. And this is important, because often what will happen is that, because, as I said, their primary motivation is being popular, they may not say anything, or they may say the opposite of what they think, because they don't want to offend or confront somebody. So be aware of that, because if they think to themselves, if I say this will annoy someone, or they'll think less of me, they will often think twice about saying it. So it means you've got to delve a little bit deeper with the peacock, and of course, once the trust levels are built with the peacock, they'll be quite happy to be open with you, and because they know that there's nothing at stake in terms of the relationship. But for people who you don't know particularly well, that can sometimes be an issue. Finish on a positive note in your conversations with the peacock can be very, very important as well. So in other words, if you've had a conflict with a peacock, it's good to finish on a positive note anywhere, but I think particularly with the peacock, they need to understand the bigger picture because they relate to that. All right, now the bull is an interesting one because the bull, remember, as I said earlier, if you threaten their status power, you can expect conflict. So now that doesn't mean you should shy away from the bull as a personality. It doesn't mean that you just let them walk all over you. That is not what I'm saying, and you need to be very clear about that. And in fact, if you don't stand up to the bull at times, you'll end up in strife because they'll perceive you as being weak. But if you do threaten their power and their status, you can expect that they will bite back. And that may not be a bad thing, but just be aware of that. Because remember, being in control is really important to the bull. I think the most important tip I would give you in dealing with a powerful bull is to insist on two-way communication. Now, what I mean by that is that because this can be a dominant personality, they may want to take charge. So what you need to do is to be firm, and you need to insist on two-way dialogue, because if you don't do that, you'll end up, I've seen it happen all the time. When you're dealing with a powerful bull, what's the tendency to do? Take a step back. And what does the bull do? They take a step towards you. And you end up thinking to yourself, well, hang on a minute, I've let them have their sort of way and they're sort of taking over. The argument, if you talk to a bull, would be simple. They'd be saying, look, there was a vacuum there that needed to be filled, and I decided to fill it. So this is why being firm is very important when you're dealing with the powerful bull. And in fact, if you are firm with the bull, there will be a view, they will view that as strength. It'll be like a mirror image of themselves. They will appreciate that. And that's why that one is quite important. But the other thing to remember is they're not actually out to hurt. And this is something that's also misunderstood about the bull. They aren't actually out to hurt people. They're usually straight to the point. Small talk's not their forte. But they're not really there to hurt people. And I think this is something that people don't understand because they're not into the chit-chat and the small talk. They're very much, as I said before, task-focused. There can be a view that they are actually out to hurt. Well, they're not. They won't spend a second thinking about it. They're moved on to the next thing. So it's very, very important when you're dealing with a bull to be firm and to the point. Don't waffle on with all the details and all the justifications. You might appreciate that from somebody else, but the fact is, if you're dealing with a bull, they won't. They want to know what the bottom line is. In fact, they'll often use those words. They'll often say, well, look, what is the bottom line here? What are you trying to achieve here? So be firm and to the point is very, very important. And realise that they're not noted for their outward displays of compassion. Okay, so again, if they show compassion publicly at least, it could be construed as a sign of weakness, so they don't go there. So just be aware that they don't wear their heart on their sleeve, and that in itself is not a problem. It's just the way that bull is. So that's a couple of things there. The most important thing, of course, is to be firm and to the point with them. They appreciate that. Now, the owl is an interesting personality. You've got to be very careful dealing with the owl. They are hurt very easily. Of the four personality types, the owls are the ones that are actually hurt the easiest. And because of that, you've got to be very careful of how you say things, how you express things. Because the owl, remember, is a thinker. And because they're thinkers, they will tend to go away and brood. And what will happen, where I had that typo before, is they'll often go away and sulk. So be careful about how you phrase things. Think carefully about the way you get your point across to the owl. Realize that they are programmed with a mindset that can easily assess risk. So they're not necessarily negative per se, but what will happen is if there's a proposal on the table, they will often think through the pitfalls around that. In fact, and then they'll share that with you because remember, they've been thinking that through. So don't misunderstand that as somebody that's just being negative. They've just thought about the consequences of the action that's being taken. And so therefore, they're probably right as well because they've put in the hard yards, they put in the thinking. So just don't dismiss it as just being negative. So for example, if you said to the owl, oh, you're just being negative, that won't go over very well at all with the owl. And of course, because they've put in all this thinking and they're probably sharing that with you with great pride because they can see a problem with that. It is very, very important when you're dealing with an owl to answer their questions. They want you to, now you might not have the answer, of course, but don't be flippant. It is very important to be able to give them some sort of an informed response to their question because they are perfectionists. They want the answer. Now, if you don't know, it's better to say to them, I don't know, and I'll investigate it, rather than saying to them or just waffling on about something very glib. They won't appreciate that at all, and that probably will precipitate some degree of conflict. Try to keep to a reasonable schedule because owls don't appreciate sloppiness in other people. So if you say you're going to start a meeting at 10 o'clock, then it's a good idea to start the meeting at 10 o'clock anyway, but the owl will be the one who will be particularly upset if the schedule's not kept. Don't make promises you can't keep because the owl will hold you to those promises. They will make the assumption that what you say is your word, and if you go back on your word, it can be extremely frustrating for the owl. And realise that your arguments must be backed up with some substance. If you're going to argue with an owl, then you need to make sure that you've got your facts straight because they certainly won't respect you if you haven't got your facts straight. So make sure you do that. Make sure you've got your ducks in a row before you approach the owl. All right. Now, finally, the lamb. And let's talk about that and then we'll pretty much wrap up. So guys, if you've got any questions, any comments, any observations, just type them in the question box because I'm more than happy to answer them. So just go for your life, type your questions in. Now let's talk about the lamb. The lamb is realise that they need to be clear of the direction you're taking. So the lamb needs to know exactly what is necessary and required. And if you don't give a lamb some very clear, very obvious directions, they'll feel enormously insecure because they will be worried about making a mistake. In other words, not following what it is that you suggest. So you need to be very specific with a lamb about what you want them to do. Now, if you do that, you'll find that they'll respond particularly well to that and they'll often go off and achieve the results that you want. Try to help them actually to set some targets. So, start talking to them in terms of where they could be up to at the end of today or next week on a project or whatever you're doing is a good idea because then you're both on the same page. You won't be disappointed and they will know what the expectation is and be able to meet that. Remember, they're not going to, they will avoid conflict if they have to, and anything you can do to clear the pathway for them will make them feel far more responsive and secure about dealing with whatever it is they need to deal with. They don't show lots of enthusiasm necessarily in the work that they do. I mean, they don't wear their heart on their sleeve, but ultimately, just because they're not as demonstrative like the peacock doesn't mean that they're not engaged in the process. So don't misread that. Realize this is an important point. Realize that when they put things off, it's their quiet form of control. So, when sometimes you give someone a job to do and for some reason it goes in the too hard basket and, you get frustrated and you think, where's that thing? Normally what that is it probably suggests that as a personality type, they're a lamb. And what they're doing is they're quietly putting it off because, quite frankly, they don't want to do it. And instead of saying to you, I don't want to do this, or I don't see the value in doing this and I'm not going to do it, they just quietly don't do it. And so as a result of that, you end up getting very frustrated with them. It's probably their quiet form of protest. And the other thing about the lamb, I think that's very good with managing the lamb, is try to get some mutual commitment. So use these questions. Say to people, can I get your commitment? Can I get your commitment to have this report done by the close of business today? That's not disrespectful. You want them to nod, grunt, or say yes. And if they nod, grunt, or say yes, there's a mutual commitment. And they won't want to go back on their commitment. And so if you get a commitment from a lamb, it's likely that they'll follow through on that, which is very important. All right. So Sam's just saying, especially if you know they don't want to do it. Yes. Good point. Samantha's just saying about the lamb, get their commitment, especially if you know they don't want to do it. Absolutely. That's gold. Thank you. Yeah. So look, it's not hard. Any of you can do this. Just look the person in the eye and just say, look, can I get you? You can preface it. You can say, this is really important that this gets done. Can I get your commitment to get it done by the close of business today? And then just pause and you're looking for something. If you get that commitment, fantastic, they'll follow through. And if you don't, well, you can talk about why. And that becomes interesting in itself. So thanks, Sam. So I guess the message out of today is a pretty straightforward message, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. Now, there's a golden rule, of course, and that's treat people how you want to be treated, and that's fine. But in terms of dealing with conflict and dealing with the personality types, I think a better rule would be treat people how they want to be treated. In other words, understand the personality types and respond accordingly. You don't have to be phony and not yourself. You can still be yourself, but try to treat them how they want to be treated. And I think if you do that, you'll get a much better result in terms of dealing with conflict. So does anyone else have any comments or questions they'd like to ask or observations they'd like to share with the rest of the group? Now's your time, because we're just about done. Okay, nothing comes to mind. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you the normal homework. So if you go to I had a few questions over the fortnight about getting into your learning platform. I hope everyone's now been able to get into your learning platform. Just to remind you, your learning platform is just your email address, and the password is welcome20, no space, welcome20 with a capital W. Takes you in. You'll find that there's the only module that you should have there when you get into that screen is the conflict one. You click on that, of course, and you've got 6 units, and the 6 units, of course, are the units that correspond with these webinars. So the whole idea is to go in there. Now, if you go in there to Unit 2, you'll find the diagnostic, the personality diagnostic. And when I'm finished here in a couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is I'll upload the video, and I've already uploaded the slides. So I'll upload the video, and all of those things are there. So don't lose sight of that. The learning platform is part of the deal. And I think spending a bit of time on those things, I think, is very, very important. If you get trouble getting in or something, just let me know. You're not at all disturbing me. Is it too late to watch session 1? Demi asks. No, Demi, they're there. So if you just go back to unit 1, Demi, you just click on look, the heading under there is slides and recording. So you just go in there and you click on it and it'll play right there and then. So no, never too late. They're all there. That's part of the deal. They're all part of that. So look, if any of you can't make future sessions, I mean, it's great if you do make them, of course, because I don't want to be just talking to myself for an hour. But the whole idea is that, for whatever reason you've got a meeting or something, that's what they're there for. Okay, no worries, Demi. Thank you for the question. Okay, so next time we meet, we're going to start looking at probably one of the biggest issues of dealing with conflict, and that is dealing with emotion. Sorry, I just had another question there, I think. Let's see. Is there a question? Okay, no, there was nothing there. That's okay. Yeah, look, I just think that dealing with emotion is the thing that really stops us in a lot of cases. You feel this enormous panic or whatever, and so because you feel this sense of panic, it's an unpleasant feeling. And because it's an unpleasant feeling, you perhaps don't act the way you should. So it's an important topic when we meet again in a fortnight. So we'll address that. And then, of course, we'll go on to the other units, but I won't get ahead of myself there. All right. Well, thanks, folks. I hope you got something useful out of that. I hope that's been answered a few of your questions. Go into the learning platform, as I said, because there's a lot of interesting information there as well. So have a great rest of the week. We will catch up. Very, very. I'm just going to see if there's a question here that I missed. Megan's just asking, when this is over, can you please tell me again how I go to my mobile phone, as I missed it at the start? Megan, I'm not sure what you're getting at there. Send me an email, Megan. I'm not sure what that means. Thanks, Jethro. That's great feedback. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, thanks, Megan. That'd be good. All right, folks. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll catch up in a fortnight. Thank you, and goodbye.